On the night of September 8, 1993, in a cramped, cold room in a communal apartment in St. Petersburg, a young man sat down to write a final, damning letter. The city outside, once called Leningrad, was a whirlwind of newfound freedom and post-Soviet chaos. But inside this room, history was closing in on a single, unbearable point. The young man was 18 years old. His name was Dmitri Kazakov. He'd only just begun his adult life, yet he was preparing to end it. The note he left was not long. It was not a plea for understanding, nor a cry of rage against a cruel world. It was a confession, a verdict delivered upon himself. He wrote that he had finally uncovered the truth of what had happened to his parents, Anatoly and Elena, who had vanished from his life 11 years earlier. And in that truth, he had found his own guilt. He did not blame the state. He did not blame the secret police or the neighbor who made the call. He blamed himself. The note concluded with a simple, devastating sentence. I killed my parents. I cannot live with this knowledge. The next morning, his landlord found him. The official cause of death was suicide. Another tragedy in a nation littered with them. Another life lost in the turbulent wake of a collapsed empire. But Dmitri's death was not an isolated event. It was the final, terrible echo of a story that began more than a decade before with a different kind of confession. A whispered secret between two 7-year-old boys in a concrete courtyard. How does a child's innocent conversation lead to the execution of his parents? How does a state system become so finely tuned, so ruthlessly efficient, that it can weaponize the trust between best friends and turn a boy's love for his family into the very instrument of its destruction? This is not merely the story of one family's tragic fate. It is a forensic examination of a system that perfected the art of turning citizens against each other. It is the story of how totalitarianism functions, not in the grand pronouncements of its leaders or the overt brutality of its prison camps, but in the quiet, poisoned spaces between neighbors, colleagues, and even children. Our central thesis is this. The destruction of the Kazakov family reveals the ultimate success of the Soviet surveillance state. Its true power was not in its legions of uniformed officers or its sprawling gulags, but in its ability to implant the state's eyes and ears into every kitchen, every courtyard, and every schoolyard. It created a world where the most dangerous secrets were not those kept from the government, but those shared with the ones you trusted most. This is the story of how a child's whisper fell into a silent, waiting abyss, and in doing so triggered a cascade of dominoes meticulously arranged by an invisible hand. A cascade that would not stop until it had claimed every last member of his family, leaving behind nothing but a classified file and a ghost in a cold St. Petersburg apartment. To understand how this happened, we must first peel back the layers of time, back to the gray, suffocating reality of the Soviet Union in 1982. We must enter a world where the walls had ears and the future was a book that had already been written, with no deviation from the script allowed. A world that Anatoly and Elena Kazakov were willing to risk everything, including their lives, to escape. They believed they were planning a secret journey to freedom. They had no way of knowing that their greatest vulnerability, the leak that would doom them all, was not a hidden microphone or a government spy, but the beating heart of their 7-year-old son, a boy who loved them, trusted them, and in his innocence would betray them utterly. This is the autopsy of a family, dismantled piece by the state they called home. It's a journey into the heart of the Cold War, seen through the eyes of its smallest, most vulnerable victims. The Kazakovs sought a different future for their son, one of free thought and open horizons. But the system they defied was designed to ensure no one ever truly escaped its grasp. It was a system that, long after its own collapse, would reach out from the grave and claim one final victim. The story of Dmitri Kazakov is a chilling testament to the fact that while empires may fall and ideologies may crumble, the guilt they cultivate can linger forever, a poison passed down from one generation to the next. The dominoes were set. The first one was about to be pushed, and it would be pushed by the hand of a child. To comprehend the sheer desperation that drove a family like the Kazakovs to contemplate such a perilous act as defection, we must first dismantle the myth of the late-stage Soviet Union. From the outside, and through the lens of state propaganda, the USSR of the early 1980s projected an image of monolithic stability. This was the era of Leonid Brezhnev, a time retrospectively branded the era of stagnation. And the myth was one of predictability, of a society that had, after the turbulent terrors of Stalin and the chaotic reforms of Khrushchev, finally settled into a comfortable if somewhat drab rhythm. The state provided for you, from cradle to grave. It gave you a job, an apartment, an education, and a sense of collective purpose. In return, it asked only for your unwavering loyalty. But beneath this veneer of placid conformity lay a reality of profound and corrosive decay. The stability was a facade for stagnation. The economic engine of the superpower was sputtering, choked by the inefficiencies of central planning and the crippling expense of the arms race. For the average citizen, this wasn't an abstract geopolitical reality. It was the daily, grinding experience of life. It was the endless queues for basic necessities, the shoddy consumer goods that broke almost immediately, the monotonous diet, and the pervasive sense of a horizon that was shrinking, not expanding. It was a world painted in shades of gray, the gray of concrete apartment blocks, the gray of the winter sky, and the gray of a future that promised only more of the same. This was the world of Anatoly and Elena Kazakov. They lived in Leningrad, the former imperial capital of St. Petersburg, a city of breathtaking beauty and revolutionary history, now shrouded in the uniformity of the Soviet project. Their home was a standard apartment on Bukarestskaya Street, one of countless identical concrete buildings erected during the Khrushchev era's mass housing drive. These structures, nicknamed Khrushchevkas, were symbols of progress in their time, promising private apartments to families long crammed into communal living spaces. But by the 1980s, they had become symbols of the system's limitations. The walls were notoriously thin, offering little acoustic privacy. A neighbor's argument, a baby's cry, a snippet of a forbidden radio broadcast, all could bleed through the concrete, a constant reminder that private life was an illusion. In the Soviet Union, you were never truly alone. Anatoly Kazakov was a product of this system and in many ways an ideal one. He was a mid-level engineer at a defense research facility. This was a position of relative prestige. The military-industrial complex was the jewel in the Soviet crown, the one sector that received the best funding, the best resources, and the best minds. To work there was to be a trusted servant of the state. But it came with a price. His work, designing components for military radio equipment, was sensitive. It meant his file was thicker, his background more thoroughly checked, his life more closely monitored than that of an ordinary citizen. He was an asset, but every asset is also a potential liability. He was a cog in the great machine of Soviet defense, a position that afforded him a stable life but chained him to the state in a way few others were. He could not easily change jobs, he could not travel freely, and he certainly could not express dissent. Elena Kazakova's world was different, yet constrained by the same ideological architecture. As a literature teacher for 5th and 6th graders, she was a custodian of the Soviet soul. Her role was to shape the minds of the next generation. But this was a perilous task. Literature, by its very nature, encourages critical thinking, empathy, and the exploration of complex human truths. In the Soviet system, however, literature was a tool of the state. Every book on the curriculum, every poem, every author was carefully selected to reinforce party doctrine. Teaching Pushkin or Tolstoy was not simply an exercise in literary analysis. It was an act of ideological instruction. Elena would have had to walk a constant tightrope, nurturing her students' love for language while carefully sanitizing any interpretation that might deviate from the approved narrative. How do you teach the beauty of a poem about freedom to children who will never truly know it? How do you discuss the moral complexities of a classic novel in a society that insists on absolute moral certainty? For a woman of intellect and passion, this daily compromise must have felt like a slow death of the spirit. Together, Anatoly and Elena represented a specific and increasingly troubled segment of Soviet society, the intelligentsia. They were educated, cultured, and possessed an awareness of the world beyond the borders of the Iron Curtain. They would have had access, however limited, to whispers of a different reality, perhaps through illicitly circulated books, foreign radio broadcasts listened to in secret, or simply by reading between the lines of the suffocating official culture. They saw the gap between the world promised by the state and the world they actually inhabited. And then there was Dmitri. Born in 1974, he was the center of their universe, the reason for their quiet anxieties and their desperate hopes. They looked at their 7-year-old son, a bright and curious boy, and saw not the product of a successful socialist experiment, but a mind that was being molded, constrained, and prepared for a life of conformity. Elena would come home from a day of teaching state-approved truths and have to help her son with his own ideologically saturated homework. Anatoly would return from his sensitive work, unable to speak of its pressures, and see in his son's eyes a future that was already mapped out for him. School, the young pioneers, the Komsomol, military service, and then a job assigned by the state. They were not just dissatisfied with their own lives, they were terrified by the life being prepared for their son. This was the true antagonist in their story, not a person, but a system that demanded the sacrifice of individual aspiration at the altar of the collective. Their decision to defect was not born of a single moment of crisis, but from the slow, cumulative pressure of 1,000 daily indignities. It was the dream of raising their son in a world where he could say what he thought, read what he wished, and become whomever he chose to be. This was a dream so powerful that it made them willing to risk an act the state considered the ultimate betrayal. Treason. The plan itself was a model of desperate ingenuity. A family vacation to Bulgaria, a fellow member of the Eastern Bloc, was an achievable goal. It wouldn't raise the same red flags as a request to visit a Western country. From Bulgaria, their itinerary was a phantom one, a secret path sketched out in hushed conversations. They would slip across the border into Yugoslavia, a socialist but non-aligned nation that served as a precarious stepping stone to the West. From there, their goal was Austria, a neutral territory and a gateway to the free world, where they could walk into an American or British embassy and declare their intention to start over. It was a plan that relied on absolute, perfect secrecy. Every step was fraught with danger. A suspicious customs agent, a talkative travel companion, a piece of misplaced luggage, any of these could unravel everything. But the greatest danger lay closer to home, within the thin walls of their own apartment, in the heart of their own city. In the Soviet Union, the state's surveillance apparatus was not just an external force, it was internalized. People learned to police their own thoughts, to watch their own words. Anatoly and Elena knew this. They spoke in whispers. They met with their contact, a facilitator, in secret. They packed their lives into suitcases under the guise of packing for a holiday. But they made one crucial and tragically human miscalculation. They failed to account for the one person in their home who was not yet conditioned by the system's paranoia. The one person who saw the world not as a web of secrets and lies, but as a place of simple truths. Their son, Dmitri. And it was through him that the system, the great silent antagonist, would find its way in. For a 7-year-old boy, the world of adults is a landscape of half-understood conversations and mysterious tensions. In the weeks leading up to the night of April 14, 1982, Dmitri Kazakov knew something was wrong. The familiar rhythm of his family's life had been disrupted. The air in their small apartment was thick with an unspoken anxiety. His parents, once a source of stability and comfort, now moved like ghosts in their own home. Conversations would drop to a whisper the moment he entered a room. Dinners were punctuated by long, heavy silences. His mother, Elena, seemed perpetually distracted, her mind a million miles away during moments that were once filled with questions about his day at school. His father, Anatoly, carried a new weight on his shoulders, a deep furrow in his brow that never seemed to disappear. Children are exquisitely sensitive to the emotional weather of their homes. Dmitri didn't need to understand the specifics. He could feel the pressure building. That night, drawn by the urgent, hushed tones coming from behind his parents' closed bedroom door, his curiosity overcame him. He pressed his ear to the wood, entering a secret world he was never meant to discover. The words he heard were a confusing jumble of familiar and foreign places. Bulgaria, that he knew. It was the vacation, the exciting trip they were all looking forward to. But then other, stranger names emerged. Yugoslavia, Austria, the West. He heard his father's voice, tight with urgency, speaking of crossing a border, of someone who would help them. He heard his mother's voice, laced with fear but also a steely resolve. And then he heard a phrase that, even in his limited understanding, resonated with a profound and terrifying finality. His mother said she could not bear to raise him in a place where his future was already decided for him. They were talking about leaving. Leaving forever. The click of the door latch was like a gunshot in the silent apartment. He was discovered. His father pulled him into the room, his face a mask of shock and fear. His mother was crying silently. The moment that followed was a critical juncture, a desperate attempt to put a lid on a secret that was now dangerously exposed. They made him promise. They impressed upon him, with all the gravity two terrified parents could muster, that he must never, ever repeat what he had heard. It was just adult talk, they insisted, just silly vacation planning. But the intensity in their eyes told a different story. It was a secret of monumental importance, a secret that now rested on the narrow shoulders of a 7-year-old boy. The weight of such a secret is almost impossible for a child to bear. It's a physical burden, a knot of anxiety that tightens with each passing day. Dmitri's promise, though earnestly made, was a fragile vessel for such a heavy truth. In the days that followed, the evidence mounted, transforming his overheard fragments into a concrete reality. He watched his mother packing. These were not the actions of someone preparing for a 2-week holiday. She carefully folded a precious lace tablecloth, an heirloom from her own mother that was only ever used on the most special occasions. She packed old family photo albums, images of a life they were about to sever. She wrapped his father's grandfather's watch, a tangible link to their past, and tucked it away. These were acts of preservation, of carrying a world with them because they knew they could never return to it. For Dmitri, each packed heirloom was another confirmation of the terrifying truth. They were leaving everything behind. The pressure inside him built until it became unbearable. And in mid-May, less than 2 weeks before their departure, it found its release. The setting was the most ordinary of places, the drab courtyard of their apartment complex. It was a shared public space, yet for the children who played there, it was a kingdom. Its rusted swing set and broken slide were the backdrop to their lives. Here, with his best friend, an 8-year-old named Mikhail Petrov, Dmitri's world felt safe. Their friendship was the kind of intense, almost familial bond that forms in childhood. They were neighbors, classmates, brothers in all but blood. In the logic of a child's heart, a best friend is not an outsider. They are a part of you, a safe repository for your most important thoughts. And so, Dmitri told him, we don't know the exact words. Perhaps it was a boast, tinged with sadness. Perhaps it was a tearful goodbye. But the substance was clear. We are going away, to the west, and we are not coming back. To Dmitri, this was not a betrayal. It was an act of profound trust, of sharing his overwhelming burden with the only other person in his world he felt could help him carry it. He was saying goodbye to his best friend in the only way he knew how. This single conversation was the inciting incident, the tiny, almost imperceptible push that set the entire tragedy in motion. The first domino had fallen. It struck the next one that very evening when Mikhail went home. Filled with the importance of his friend's news, he did what any child would do. He told his parents. And here, the story pivots from a childhood drama to a matter of state security. Because Mikhail's father, Viktor Petrov, was not just any parent. He was a sergeant in the Leningrad militia, the Soviet Union's police force. Viktor was a man forged by the system he served. A veteran of military service, he was a believer in order, discipline, and the unshakable authority of the state. To him, society was a structure, and his job was to maintain its integrity, to identify and neutralize any cracks in the foundation. When his 8-year-old son relayed this story, Viktor did not dismiss it as playground fantasy. His mind, trained in the art of suspicion, immediately saw the potential implications. He knew the Kazakov family. He knew Anatoly worked in the defense sector. The words "going west" and "not coming back," when connected to a defense employee, were not idle chatter. They were a red flag of the highest order. Defection was not merely leaving. It was an act of treason, a security breach that could have untold consequences. Viktor Petrov's response was methodical, professional, and utterly devoid of sentiment. He questioned his son carefully. What were the exact words? Who else was there? Was he certain? He extracted the raw data from his son, who answered with the innocent honesty of a child who trusts his father implicitly. Mikhail had no concept of the mechanism he was helping to activate. He was just telling his dad what his friend had told him. The next morning, on May 16, 1982, Viktor Petrov went to his precinct and filed an official report. He did his duty. He noted the source was his own child, and that the information was second-hand from another child, acknowledging its potential unreliability. But he also dutifully included the crucial, damning facts: Anatoly Kazakov's place of employment and the family's upcoming officially approved trip abroad. He typed up the information, signed his name, and fed the piece of paper into the bureaucratic machine. He had taken a child's whispered secret and translated it into the cold, official language of the state. The second domino had now fallen, striking the formidable machinery of the Committee for State Security, the KGB. The Kazakov family was no longer just a family with a secret plan. They were now a case file 4788K, and the clock on their lives had just started ticking down. When Viktor Petrov's report landed on a desk within the Leningrad branch of the KGB, it passed through a finely calibrated filter of institutional paranoia. The Soviet state security apparatus was a vast organism, constantly sifting through an ocean of information, of whispers, rumors, and denunciations. The system of donos, or informing, was a cornerstone of social control, actively encouraged by the state. It created a society where anyone, a jealous colleague, a resentful neighbor, a zealous party member, could become an unpaid agent of the state. Most of these tips were noise, the petty grievances of daily life weaponized for personal gain. They led nowhere. But the report on the Kazakov family was different. It contained a perfect trinity of triggers. First, the subject, Anatoly Kazakov, was a defense sector employee. Even if he wasn't designing nuclear warheads, his position placed him within the sacred inner sanctum of the state. The defection of any such individual was not just a potential intelligence loss, it was a profound propaganda failure. It suggested a crack in the ideological armor of the Soviet Union, an admission that one of its own trusted servants had chosen the enemy. Second, the family had an imminent, approved trip abroad. This provided a clear timeline and a credible means of escape. The threat was not abstract. It was concrete and time-sensitive. The third element, however, was the problem, the source. The entire case was built on a chain of information passed from a 7-year-old to an 8-year-old. In any normal legal system, this would be dismissed as inadmissible hearsay. But the KGB did not operate under the norms of a liberal democracy. Its guiding principle was not the presumption of innocence, but the preemption of threat. The weakness of the source did not invalidate the report, it simply dictated the next step. They couldn't arrest the Kazakovs based on a child's tale. They needed confirmation. They needed to transform the whisper into evidence. The case was assigned to the Second Chief Directorate, the KGB's powerful counterintelligence wing responsible for internal security. On May 17th, the full, yet discreet force of their surveillance capabilities was brought to bear on the Kazakov family. This was not the clumsy, obvious tailing seen in spy films. It was a patient, methodical, and suffocating art form. Teams of plainclothes agents, known as Topchuni, would have begun watching the apartment building on Bukhareskaya Street. They would have worked in shifts, melting into the urban landscape, becoming just another face in the crowd. They documented every movement, Anatoly leaving for work, Elena going to the market, Dmitri playing in the courtyard. Their very presence, unseen and unknown, transformed the family's daily life into a series of data points for a secret file. Simultaneously, a technical operations team would have placed a tap on the family's telephone line. Every call, every click, every silence would be recorded and analyzed. Inside the defense facility, Anatoly's personnel file would be quietly pulled and scrutinized. His work was reviewed for any irregularities, any unusual requests for data. Colleagues were likely discreetly interviewed, asked about his mood, his political remarks, his general disposition. Had he seemed discontent? Had he made any anti-Soviet jokes? The net was cast wide, searching for any corroborating thread. For 3 days, the surveillance yielded nothing. The Kazakovs, hyper-aware of the need for secrecy, were living cautiously. They used their phones sparingly. They met with no one out of the ordinary. The KGB had a ticking clock, the family's departure date of May 27th, and a case built on nothing but a playground rumor. The investigation could have stalled, died in the files from a lack of evidence. But then, on May 20th, the Kazakovs made their fatal mistake. Anatoly met a man named Grigory Lebedev at a small nondescript cafe. To any casual observer, it was a brief, forgettable encounter. 2 men sharing a table for less than 10 minutes, speaking in low voices. But the KGB were not casual observers, and they knew exactly who Grigory Lebedev was. He was already in their files, a suspected facilitator of illegal border crossings. He was a ghost, a professional who moved through the shadows of the Soviet underground, leaving little trace. The KGB had been watching him sporadically for over a year, but had never been able to build a case. This meeting was the missing link. The connection between Anatoly, the disgruntled defense employee, and Lebedev, the professional escape artist, transformed the KGB's suspicion into near certainty. It was the concrete evidence of intent that they desperately needed. The domino of surveillance had struck the domino of confirmation. There was no more time for observation. The order was given to move. On the evening of May 21st, the state's invisible machinery became terrifyingly visible. 2 black Volga sedans, the ubiquitous and feared vehicles of the KGB, pulled up to the curb. 6 officers in plain clothes entered the building. The heavy knock on the Kazakov's door was not a request. It was a summons. Neighbors who witnessed the scene would later describe the quiet, brutal efficiency of the arrest. Anatoly opened the door and was met with the flat, emotionless statement that he was required for questioning. Elena's panicked protests were ignored. She was to come as well. The most heartbreaking part of the scene was Dmitri. A neighbor saw an officer lead the confused 7-year-old out into the hallway. He was calling for his mother. Elena tried to reach for him, a mother's final, desperate instinct, but she was held back. The family unit was systematically broken apart. Anatoly and Elena were put in one car. Dmitri was placed in another. As the Volgas pulled away from the curb, Dmitri Kazakov saw his parents for the very last time. The interrogation began immediately, in separate windowless rooms in the KGB's detention centers. The techniques were psychologically devastating, designed to dismantle a person's will. Isolation, sleep deprivation, and relentless circular questioning were standard practice. For 3 days, Anatoly held firm, denying everything. But on the 4th day, he broke. He confessed to the entire plan, insisting he had done it for his son's future and begging them to spare his wife. His plea was futile. Elena, interrogated separately, corroborated his story. The state now had what it valued most: signed confessions. The final act was a mere formality. The trial, held on June 28, 1982, was a piece of legal theater. Conducted in a closed military tribunal, it was swift and predetermined. The charge was treason, under Article 64 of the Criminal Code. In the Soviet legal system, especially for political crimes, the concept of a fair defense was non-existent. The confessions and the surveillance report were presented. The verdict was guilty. The sentence, mandated for this crime, was death. There was no appeal. On July 2, 1982, just over 6 weeks after Dmitri told his secret in the courtyard, Anatoly and Elena Kazakov were executed by a military firing squad. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves. Their names were erased. Their apartment was reassigned. The state had completed its work. It had identified a threat, confirmed it, neutralized it, and erased it from existence. The dominoes had fallen, one after another, with ruthless, chilling precision. But one domino was still standing, left alone in the wreckage. A 7-year-old boy, now an orphan of the state, who had just been transferred to a children's home, asking the same question over and over to caretakers who had no answers. Where are my parents? The execution of Anatoly and Elena Kazakov was not the end of the story. It was merely the end of their lives. For their son, Dmitri, it was the beginning of a long, hollow existence, a childhood defined by an absence he could not comprehend. The Soviet state, having declared his parents enemies, now took ownership of their only child. He was absorbed into the state care system, a vast network of orphanages and children's homes designed to raise loyal, productive Soviet citizens. But Dmitri was not like the other children. He was the son of traitors, a label that, while perhaps not officially stamped on his file, would have followed him like a shadow. He was moved between facilities, a common practice to prevent the formation of deep emotional attachments that might compete with loyalty to the state. From a home in Novgorod back to the outskirts of Leningrad, his childhood was a blur of institutional walls and unfamiliar faces. Teachers and caretakers from those years would later describe a boy who was profoundly withdrawn, intelligent, but disconnected. He built a fortress of silence around himself, seeking refuge in books, the only place he could go where no one could follow. He was a ghost haunting his own youth. The one fragile link to his past was his paternal grandmother, Klavdia Kazakova. A widowed pensioner, she fought a desperate bureaucratic war to gain custody of her grandson. She wrote letters, filed appeals, and pleaded with impassive officials, insisting she could provide a proper, ideologically sound upbringing. Her every request was denied. The state's logic was cold and absolute. The child of traitors required special supervision, a form of ideological re-education to cleanse him of his parents' corrupting influence. Klavdia was permitted only brief, supervised visits. These encounters, filled with unspoken grief, were agonizing. How could she explain the inexplicable to a child? The authorities had told her only that the case was closed and her son and daughter-in-law were not returning. So she told Dmitri the only thing she could: a gentle, protective lie. They were away. They would be back when they could. As the years passed, the lie became thinner, the hope more faint. Dmitri grew from a confused boy into a quiet, solitary teenager within the confines of the system. His grandmother's visits grew less frequent as age and heartbreak took their toll. She had lost her son, her daughter-in-law, and was now slowly losing her grandson to the impenetrable walls of the state. In 1991, the world that had destroyed his family suddenly imploded. The Soviet Union collapsed. The ideology that had demanded his parents' lives was declared bankrupt. The all-powerful KGB was splintered. For Dmitri, this seismic geopolitical shift had one immediate practical consequence. In October 1992, on his 18th birthday, he was released from the system. He was now a citizen of the new Russian Federation. He was given a room in a communal apartment in the city of his birth, now once again called St. Petersburg, a small stipend, and was told to find work. He was free, but he was tethered to a past he didn't understand. The question that had haunted his entire life, what happened to my parents, now became an obsession. In the chaotic bureaucracy of early post-Soviet Russia, he began his quest. He navigated a maze of disorganized archives and suspicious clerks, filing requests under new transparency laws that were barely understood even by those meant to enforce them. He was searching for a ghost file, a piece of paper that held the key to his entire existence. In September 1993, he found it, or rather, a sympathetic archivist, a middle-aged woman who saw the profound pain in the young man's eyes, found it for him. After hours, she retrieved Case File 4788K. Gently, she laid out the brutal, skeletal facts. Arrested in May 1982, tried for treason in June, executed in July. But she gave him more than that. She gave him the reason. She told him how the investigation began, with a report from a militia sergeant named Viktor Petrov, and she told him the source of that report. His 8-year-old son, Mikhail, who had heard it from Dmitri himself. In that dusty records office, Dmitri Kazakov's world did not just break, it inverted. The vague, shadowy loss that had defined his life suddenly took on a horrifyingly sharp focus. The great, impersonal force of the state was not the prime mover. He was. His own words, spoken in a moment of childish trust and anxiety in a courtyard long ago, had been the trigger. The entire monstrous machine of surveillance, arrest, interrogation, and execution had lurched into motion because of him. He was not just a victim of the state. In his own mind, he was its accomplice. He had not just lost his parents, he had led them to their deaths. The universal lesson of the Kazakov family is a stark warning about the nature of totalitarian power. Such systems do not sustain themselves merely through overt force. Their most insidious and effective tool is the corrosion of trust. They thrive by destroying the private sphere, by making every citizen a potential agent of the state, and by turning the most fundamental human bonds, of friendship, of neighborhood, of family, into potential liabilities. Viktor Petrov was not a mustache-twirling villain. He was a functionary doing what he believed was his duty, a man so conditioned by the system that he saw a state security issue where others might have seen a child's fantasy. Mikhail Petrov was not malicious. He was a little boy who trusted his father. And Dmitri was a child crushed by a secret he was never meant to carry. The system took these ordinary human interactions and twisted them into a death sentence. It created a world where the most dangerous thing you could do was to confide in someone. This legacy of suspicion haunts many post-authoritarian societies today. It raises profound questions for our own time. In an age of unprecedented digital surveillance, where our words and movements are tracked and stored in ways the KGB could only have dreamed of, how do we protect the private spaces where trust can flourish? When governments encourage citizens to report on one another, whether for public health violations or perceived ideological impurity, at what point does civic duty bleed into the culture of denunciation that destroyed the Kazakovs. Dmitri Kazakov walked out of that archive and into a city he no longer recognized, carrying a truth that was a poison. The collapse of the Soviet Union meant nothing to him. The new freedoms meant nothing. His parents were gone, his childhood was a lie, and the guilt was an entity so absolute it blotted out the sun. His suicide note was his final, tragic attempt to balance the scales, to take responsibility in a system that had taught him none of its architects would ever be held to account. There is no memorial to Anatoly, Elena, and Dmitri Kazakov. Their story exists only in the brittle pages of a KGB file and the fading memories of those who knew them. Their tragedy serves as a powerful, intimate reminder of the human cost of an ideology that places the state above the individual. It demonstrates that the first and most vital casualty of any totalitarian project is not freedom of speech or freedom of assembly, but the freedom to trust. The simple, sacred faith that the person you are speaking to is not an extension of the state. The Kazakovs dreamed of a world where their son could speak freely. The devastating irony is that he did. And in the world they lived in, that was the most dangerous freedom of all.